chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. As a text, Genesis 6:1-4 is difficult to interpret. In the words of the CSB Study Bible, this brief portion of Genesis is one of the most controversial sections of the entire Bible. Major disagreements surround each of these verses. Careful study of the Hebrew text does not end the debates. If anything, it only sharpens them. We will be pointing out some of these debates as we read along. Verse 1. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. In other words, humanity was fulfilling God's mandate from Genesis 1 verse 28 to multiply and fill the earth. Verse 2. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The first of the debates around this text is on the identity of both groups mentioned in this verse, the sons of God and the daughters of man. Throughout the history of interpretation, 3 different basic positions have been proposed. 1. That the sons of God were heavenly beings, likely fallen angels, who engaged in sexual relations with human women, thereby violating the existing material boundary, presumably imposed by God, between the heavenly and earthly realms. 2. That the sons of God were aristocrats and men of great social power who took advantage of women of lower social standing by engaging in polygamous and promiscuous sexual relations with them, thereby suggesting that the text is condemning the sexual abuse or exploitation of lower-class women by men of privilege. 3. That the sons of God were male descendants from the godly family line of Seth, Adam's 3rd son, born to him and Eve after Cain killed Abel. See Genesis chapter 4, verses 25 to 26. And through whom we have the lineage that leads us to righteous Noah. See Genesis chapter 5. These godly male descendants from Seth married women descendants from the ungodly family line of Cain, thereby suggesting that they were spiritually incompatible or unequally yoked in their marital union. But each of these positions faces various credible biblical objections, casting doubts over its likelihood, and therefore none of these positions has managed to secure overwhelming and conclusive support amongst commentators. Verse 3. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Again, in the words of the CSB Study Bible, the meaning of this verse is one of the most disputed in the Bible. Is it about God shortening humanity's lifespans, or about God setting a time for the universal flood? There is no general agreement as to its meaning, so various Bible translations reflect translators' differing viewpoints. In other words, is this verse telling us that God limited how long people would live after the flood, something we don't immediately observe in the recorded lifespans post the flood, and would need explaining if this is our viewpoint? For example, Abraham lives to be 175 years old, Ishmael 137 years old, to name a few. Or is this verse telling us that there was a grace period of 120 years from the events recorded in verse 2 to God's judgment through the flood? Now, the biggest cause for this uncertainty is that the phrase in Hebrew, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh," contains 2 critical words that occur nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible. So there's limited lexical evidence on how to correctly translate them. They are the words translated in the ESV as abide and for in the phrase. How translators choose to translate these 2 words impacts the translation and meaning of other words in the phrase, and the ultimate meaning we ascribe to the 120 years mentioned. Verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Who were the Nephilim? And were they the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of man? The Nephilim are only ever mentioned twice in the Bible, here in Genesis 6 verse 4, and later in Numbers 13 verse 33, when the Israelite spies report that giants are living in the Promised Land. It's their mention amongst the inhabitants of the Promised Land in Numbers 13, which led to the word being mistakenly misunderstood as meaning giants. But it's unlikely that the Nephilim referred to in Genesis chapter 6 are the same Nephilim of Numbers chapter 13, given that the entire human race, except for Noah and his family, were wiped out by the flood. With regards to their origin, the Hebrew text makes no direct connection between the Nephilim and the children born from the union of the sons of God and the daughters of man. This lack of connection in the Hebrew leaves room to interpret this verse as possibly meaning that the Nephilim were in existence when the sons of God took the daughters of man as wives, and not necessarily that the Nephilim were the product of that union. But it appears from this verse that the Nephilim were renowned warriors, and so perhaps the reason the author mentions their existence at that time is to expose the fact that they may have contributed, through their warring exploits, to the violence and corruption that characterized pre-flood society, setting the scene for why God responds in the way that he does in the following verses. Verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
Let's pray together. Father, thank you so much this morning that we get to open your word together, and even the parts of your word that are difficult to understand and have got hard teachings for us, oh Lord. We thank you for them because, as your word declares, that your word is like honey unto our lips. It restores and revives our soul, and it is a lamp unto our feet. And so it is my prayer for us this morning, oh Lord, that we will truly taste and see the goodness of your word, that through it, Lord, that we will be nourished, and that it will light up our paths in ways everlasting by your grace and your goodness. And all God's people say, Amen. Well, good morning to you all. Yes, it's so good to be back with you this morning as we dive back into the book of Genesis together. And so as we begin to look at this passage in particular, I wonder how many of you have ever had a situation happen to you in your life that you never thought could ever happen? A situation that happened in your life that you never thought could ever happen. Like, for example, that one situation we hear people sometimes have nightmares about or are afraid of, that you would be publicly speaking, only then to realize that you've been naked the whole time. Now, that scenario kind of happened to me, and I guarantee you it wasn't a dream. Okay? And so about 20 years ago, I needed an ACL reconstructive surgery. Now, for those of you who do not know what an ACL is, it is an important ligament in your knee that you cannot do much without. And so you cannot do any strenuous activities or sports without an ACL. Now, my surgeon was actually attached to a medical school, and so he thought that I was an interesting case study to actually present to a panel of surgeons and students. And so on the day of my that presentation, as I was getting dressed that morning, I had the thought, should I be going commando? Now, for those of you who do not know, commando means with or without underwear. Should I be wearing any underwear? Because when he told me that he was going to present my case before this panel, the picture I had in my mind was that there was going to be lots of discussion between them. And so I didn't foresee that there would be a live demonstration as part of the program. And so the first inkling that I had, that I perhaps made the biggest mistake of my life as I decided to go commando that morning, was actually to step into that lecture hall only to discover that that panel was, I kid you not, at least 30 people strong and more. And that's just when I knew, as I walked in and saw them all, and I was like, they're going to ask me to take off my pants. And so for a moment there, I thought that my worst nightmare wasn't going to happen. As the surgeon began to actually discuss who I was, and I sustained the injury, the procedure that they were thinking, and he had all sorts of slides, and I'm just sitting there hoping, please, 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 do not say what I really think you're going to say. But then the request came. Please, take off your pants. And so I tried to discreetly signal to him to come closer, and as he came closer, I was like, hey, Chief. There's nothing down there, bro. And he was like, no, don't worry about it. They're all surgeons anyway. So what was your boy to do? So there I was, a few moments later, standing there with half my birthday suit on. And at some point, he even asked, would you walk across the stage? And as I began to walk across the stage, he began to say, oh, can you see how the what keeps on moving whenever he steps, blah, blah, blah. And the whole room was intently gazing below my waist and nodding their heads along. And I felt like saying, hey, my eyes are up here, eh? Even then, had placed me on a stretcher as he began to maneuver my leg, and he kept on asking to say, hey, how does it feel when I do blah, blah, blah? And I kept on thinking to myself, I cannot believe that this could ever happen. Now, perhaps you've got your own embarrassing story of a situation that happened in your life that you never thought could ever happen. Or perhaps it's not even embarrassing at all, right? It could have been something far more positive. Like, for example, you came into some money, lost sum of money that you never were expecting. And so it put you in a position that you could do some things with it that you never thought could ever happen. Or maybe for you, that thing that you never thought could ever happen turned out to be heartbreaking. And so perhaps you are a victim of a crime, or you were taken advantage of, or even swindled out of, some money scammed, or you received a diagnosis that you weren't expecting, or experienced a betrayal and rejection by a lover, or you suffered a mental breakdown, or perhaps you found yourself on the wrong side of a decision that you had made, where you stole something, lied about a situation, or weren't honest in your dealings, and you got caught. And the consequences that ensued are things that you wish had never happened. Now, the text that we've had read to us actually touches on something which I think we don't always think or realize could ever happen to us. Something as Christians we may be aware of, have no doubt, aware of. Or even as a non-Christian, perhaps if you're here as a non-Christian, you've heard it being said about God before. And yet we don't always functionally live as if it would ever happen to us, or that God would ever do this to us. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the reality that God will judge you. That God will judge you. Now, that's not something we expect or find it hard to actually hear, that God will judge us. Because perhaps innate to us all, we have this aversion towards being judged. And that's why perhaps in your life you've said or have heard someone say words along these lines that, how dare you judge me? How dare you judge me? And so it's hard to even hear that God would judge us, right? And so the reason behind why this is hard to hear is one, that it is hard to have to accept that there could be something wrong and worthy of being condemned about us. That there could be something wrong and worthy of being condemned about us. That's not something anyone ever wants to think of themselves in those ways, which is why then we can become so defensive or apprehensive and even aggressive when someone dares cannot to scrutinize us or calls into question what we have done and says that it needs to be changed. And so it's not surprised that standing before God, if we were to hear that we could stand one day before God and have God then challenge some of the things that we have done. Think that like, yep, you've messed up. And you actually need to be held to account for that. That it could be hard to accept because we don't like making mistakes and having to account for it. The second reason why this could be hard is that it's hard to actually have to accept that of all the people who could condemn us for our wrongs, God would be one of them. It is actually rather far more favorable or preferable for us to think in our day and age that God is all but love. All that he has for us is nothing but love, to the point where we stop thinking of him being capable of actually judging our wrong decisions and our wrong behaviors. Lose sight of that. And so it can become hard to simultaneously think that God can be both loving and judging of our conduct. We would rather that it be either or and never both. But there's biblical evidence that supports both. It supports both. But because we would prefer never to see the judging side of God, never to encounter it, we then become sort of kind of caught by surprise whenever all of a sudden God is there to rebuke, to judge. We far prefer a God who always affirms and always is accepting of what we do. And so it can catch us off guard. And so the reality that God will judge you, will judge me, is something we must be prepared to not only expect, but accept. Accept. And yet, it is also something we've got to do some work to try to really understand or comprehend. How does that reality, how do we see that reality in light of God's grace? And so how does the judgment of God relate to the grace of God? Genesis 6 and 7 reveals to us that there is actually a two-sided nature of the grace of God. On the one hand, the grace of God delivers salvation and redemption towards those who are undeserving of it. Undeserving of it. And that's the side of the grace of God that we love to see and see clearest. And we love to proclaim the loudest and love to celebrate. And yet, there is the other side of that very grace that delivers judgment and condemnation upon those who are deserving of it. And that's the side we don't often like to talk about or have it actually impact the way in which we worship God. And so we got to understand that both the redemption or the condemnation of a sinner flows from the very grace of God. That both redemption and condemnation flows from the very grace of God. In fact, when you think about it, redemption already assumes judgment and condemnation. Because you do not redeem things that are already perfect and have no need for change, right? And so if God acts in grace as he looks to redeem things, then we must assume that God has already judged that which he is redeeming as being flawed and worthy of being cast aside. That's the reality. And so both grace, in grace, both redemption and condemnation or judgment flows from the very grace of God, which then brings us to the big idea that I will hope that we'll see in these 2 weeks across Genesis 6 and 7. And it is this, that we are saved from the grace of God. From the grace of God. By the grace of God. Well, simultaneously saved from the grace of God and by the grace of God. Now, the first part of that statement is perhaps something we don't expect to ever happen to us, right? Or to ever need. And yet, as we dive into the last few verses of our text, you will see that the flood was an act of judgment from the grace of God. An act of judgment from the grace of God. Because look at how the text actually describes the state of the world pre-flood. Chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Now, not part of our text, but if you just scan down a few verses, down to verses 11 and 12, here's what we're told, more detail of what that actually looked like. Verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and filled with violence. Mid of verse 12, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And so the picture that's been painted to us of the status quo of the pre-flood society is one where wickedness, evil, violence, and corruption was rampant. To put in South African lingo, we're being told that people were going boss. They were going boss. So much so to the point where it leads to one of the saddest verses we'll ever read in the Bible. Genesis 6, verse 6. Look at this. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved them to his heart. Regretted, was grieved at heart. And so he who just 5 chapters earlier, we're told, couldn't help when he surveyed his creation, couldn't help but proclaim it was good, good, good. It's very good. We now find just 5 chapters later, he is deeply disturbed. Deeply disturbed at the pinnacle of his creation and how they have turned out. Just think about it for a moment. If you're a parent who dearly loves a child, what would they have to do in order for you to regret the day that they were born? Listen, friends, we've got to feel that about our God. Because whenever we talk about the judgment of God, the temptation is there to think God to be he's just mean and so quick-tempered that he will jump at the first chance he has to judge us for our wrong. But meanwhile, that's not the predisposition of the God that we're introduced to at the onset of the flood. And so think about it. The flood was the biggest act of God's judgment in the Old Testament. No other judgment in the Old Testament ever compares to the magnitude and devastation of God's judgment as we see in the flood. And yet, what do we see about God's predisposition in having to do that? Not a God who's raging mad and angry, but a God whose heart is broken, grieving and mourning at the state of humanity and what he would have to then do. A God who wasn't at peace at the reality, end of verse 5, that every intention of the thoughts of humanity's heart was only evil continually. Now, when you think about that phrase, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, perhaps we may think, sure, isn't that an overstatement? An overstatement of the severity of the human condition. For all you need to do is just think about our society for a moment, right? What would you observe? I have no doubt we would observe the presence of evil, no doubt. But what else will we see? We will see plenty of good things being done by people, right? Plenty of good things being done by people. And so then is this verse saying that pre-flood society, they had no evidence of good? I doubt it. It's hard to imagine that all that would have been going on was just nothing but violence, nothing but corruption, and that it would have been any different than our day and age, the world that we live in. And so what is this verse getting at? Yes, what it is trying to actually help us to see and realize about the true human condition. And so it's not just saying that evil and corruption was just running on rampant. But to get to its point, think with me on it in this way. So if you're to survey your life, right, look at your own life, I have no doubt that you'll see plenty of good things you've done in your life, right? That there's evidence of good things that you've done. And so perhaps you helped someone over here, maybe gave some money to a good cause over there, that you volunteered at some kind of charity, you fed the hungry, to name just a few things that you are proud of for every done in your life. But I also think, or that you would be foolish to believe. Also, I hope that you've never done anything in your life that could be classified as being wicked, as being evil. And I'm not just talking about that one time when you were 4 years old and stole some sweets. I'm talking about things that you would be ashamed of if it ever got out. Things you look at today, look at them now, and you can't even believe that you would do such a wicked thing. Now, here's a question for you. If that's how you feel about it now, today, then why did you ever do it? Why did you ever do it? Now, I may not know what it is that you're thinking of, but would it be right, perhaps, to say that the reason why you did such a wicked thing was because you put yourself first? You put yourself first in that situation. And that's the heart of the human problem. That we will continually find ourselves doing things we wish we had never done, simply because we put ourselves first. We put ourselves first. And so at the root of our wicked deeds is our self-centered focus. It's our self-centered focus. And we think about ourselves. Put ourselves first. And so what that verse is trying to reveal is revealing that humanity is so self-focused that when given the choice between me and you, I am likely to always choose me over you. And thereby opening up the opportunity for me to either oppress, abuse, disadvantage, deprive, demean others, all in pursuit of my own gain. That's the human heart. The depravity that we all have to deal with. And yet God in His grace will not just watch it. Will not just let it be. And so in the context of our text, how does God respond to that heart? Verse 7, so the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land. Man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. For I am sorry. I am sorry that I have made them. Now, what this verse is not saying is that God somehow realized that He had made a mistake when He created humanity. And now He needs to try to clean it up. No. What the verse is actually saying is that it is revealing the sense of God's righteous justice. His righteous justice as He looks into the world and He sees that something has spiraled out of control and that He needs to act in order to put it back in control. And so then what are we seeing? We're seeing that it is an act of God's grace that looks into the world, see the human corruption and evil that has been perpetuated. And He says, it's got to stop. We've got to do something to stop it. Which then brings us back to where we began. That it is the grace of God, that looks at human corruption and realizes that it cannot be allowed to keep running rampant and wreaking havoc without Him choosing to act in judgment towards it. And so what we were then seeing, we're seeing that God wanted to spare the world. To spare the world. The corruption and evil of humanity. And so then, next point, God's grace, it is an act of grace that brings judgment upon the wicked to actually spare the world further heartache. That whenever God acts in judgment against the wicked, He is acting in that way to spare the world. Spare the world. Further heartache because of their wickedness. And so it's an act of grace. An act of grace. Now, perhaps as we look at that and think about it, saying, okay, if pre-flood society had descended into such chaos that God had to act in judgment towards it, then how does God acting by bringing about more chaos through the devastation of a flood seems any better? Right? Is God's response, isn't God, by His response through the flood, exercising the same kind of violence He's condemning in humanity? So what do we do with it? Now the answer to that question is that we got to perceive the judgment, the judging grace of God, much in the same way we perceive the acts of a judge when he sentences a murderer to prison for life. Much in the same way, right? Because what is that judge doing when he casts that sentence over the murderer? He's essentially forcing the murderer to have to lose his or her life for having taken the life of their victim, right? And so then by that doing, it's actually excellent, well, that you have lost your right to life because of having taken someone else's right for life. And yet you and now, when we hear that verdict, we don't actually resent the judge for having acted that way, do we? Instead, what do? We applaud the judge. Why? Because believe that the judge is exercising their duty to have to protect society against such a murderous perpetrator. And so we don't view the actions of the judge like the murderer's crime. And so the judge is just and righteous on inflicting an undesirable outcome upon the murderer. And so much in the same way, when we think about the grace of God that brings judgment over people, and when it does, and when he brings this judgment, it leads to an undesirable outcome on a sinner. It makes God no less just or righteous, given what they are guilty of. And so Genesis chapter 6, here's what it is telling us. It's teaching us that God cannot keep stomaching. That he cannot keep stomaching human corruption. His grace requires, necessitates that he acts in judgment so as to preserve the world from such corruption. That's what it is teaching us. And so then extrapolate that truth to us here today. To those of us in the room who would say, yep, I am not without sin in my life. That, yep, I am guilty of sinful deeds in my life. And friends, we got to realize, along with owning up and to that confession, the grace of God requires that he delivers his judgment over you because of your sinful deed. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not something I ever want to experience. And so therefore, I'm desperate to have to be saved from the grace of God that will deliver his judgment over my life for my sinfulness. And I would hope that you would too. And so then, how can we escape? How can we escape such judgment? The answer is by receiving and clinging on to the other side of that very grace that delivers salvation and redemption upon those who are undeserving of it. That's how. And we'll look at that in more detail next week. But we cling on to, ultimately, we're clinging on to the grace that brings us redemption at the cross of Jesus Christ. And so this morning we'll celebrate communion in a moment. But what is communion reminding us of when we come to the elements of communion? It is reminding us of the death of Jesus Christ, that he offered himself up as a sacrifice on our behalf because of what we were guilty of. And so in Christ Jesus, as we take the bread, what are we reminded? We are reminded of the broken body of Jesus Christ under the burden of God's just judgment for the sins of the world. And so his body was broken so that your guilty body would never have to be. And so when we take of the juice, that red juice, it reminds us of what? Of the blood of Jesus Christ that was poured out so that it will cleanse you, even as we have sung, whiter than snow. Making you clean and free of all that you're guilty of. That's the gospel that we celebrate. That by His grace, God brings judgment, and yet by that very same grace, He extends redemption and salvation for those of us who will cling on to Christ Jesus. And so this morning I want to invite you, would you come to Christ? Would you come to Christ? Cling on to Christ as the only hope you have. The only hope you have of being saved from the grace of God that will look to bring its judgment over you for your sins.